"Daddy?" his son whispered, holding up a photo from the CEO's office, his small hands trembling. "Why is there a picture of you standing next to her?" Before we dive in, take a second to drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind in ways you won't see coming. The skyscraper stretched into the midnight sky like a blade of glass, lit with thousands of windows that looked alive from the street below. Inside, the marble lobby gleamed, not because executives cared for its beauty, but because one man with tired hands made it shine. Ethan Cole dipped his mop into the bucket and wrung it out slowly, listening to the faint squeak of wheels echo across the emptiness. At 41, he had learned to make peace with silence, even if silence often felt heavier than the bucket he pushed. The building carried the weight of ambition, deals signed in secret, fortunes made over crystal glasses of champagne. Ethan carried a different kind of weight, the kind that clung to his shoulders every time his son asked why his father had to work nights when the world slept. No one looked twice at him during the day. Executives passed him in the hallways without pausing. Interns held elevators without lifting their eyes. He wore the uniform of invisibility, a navy jumpsuit, steel-toed boots, gloves that smelled faintly of bleach. He blended into corners, into reflections on polished surfaces, into the background hum of HVAC vents. Yet behind that quiet exterior his eyes missed nothing. He saw the smirk of the CFO when layoffs were whispered about. He heard the sigh of the receptionist who balanced 3 phones at once. He knew the name of every guard, every delivery driver, every caterer who came and went like ghosts. He knew what it meant to live below the notice of those who thought they ran the world. When the last office light clicked off and the elevator chimes faded, Ethan would begin his ritual. First the lobby, its marble floor cold underfoot, then the executive suites, where he wiped down the conference table that had hosted arguments disguised as strategy sessions. Finally, the boardroom, with its sweeping view of Manhattan. He would polish the long glass table until he could see himself staring back, an older man with lines carved deep by grief and survival, a man who looked older than 41, but younger than the battles he had fought. At home, things were different, or at least he tried to make them so. His son Noah was 10, sharp-eyed and endlessly curious. The boy's hair was the same chestnut brown as his mother's, though he barely remembered her. She had passed when Noah was still in diapers, and Ethan had raised him alone ever since. Every night before work, Noah would curl up at the kitchen table with his sketchbook while Ethan packed a thermos of coffee. "Do you ever get tired of cleaning up after people, Dad?" Noah had asked once, his small fingers smudged with pencil lead. Ethan had paused, searching for an answer that wouldn't taste like bitterness. "Work isn't about being noticed," he'd said finally. "It's about doing it well, even if nobody thanks you." Noah had nodded, as though the truth of that weighed more than his father realized. Still, there were nights when Ethan's chest ached with unspoken truths. He thought of the life he once dreamed of, the music he no longer played, the woman he once loved and lost. The skyscraper gave him no room for those thoughts. Its corridors demanded efficiency, not reflection, and yet, in the reflection of those polished floors, he often saw the ghost of the man he used to be, full of fire, full of promise. He pushed the mop harder, as if erasing the memory along with the dirt. The truth was, Ethan noticed everything, because noticing was all he had left. He noticed how the executives' laughter echoed differently after a deal went bad. He noticed the cleaning staff from another company who came once a month and treated him with the respect executives never did. He noticed the way New York itself changed outside the high windows, the skyline shifting with each season, the pulse of the city keeping him awake long after his shift ended. But most of all, he noticed Noah. The way his son tilted his head when he drew, the way his eyes softened when he asked about his mother, the way he always said goodnight with a hug that lingered a second longer than necessary. To most people, Ethan was just a janitor. But to Noah, he was everything. provider, protector, the steady anchor in a world that often felt like it belonged to everyone else. Ethan carried that weight willingly, but quietly. The world didn't clap for men like him. The world didn't pause to honor the ones who cleaned its footprints. Yet he knew deep down that silence could be as sacred as applause. On this particular night, as he buffed the brass handles of the main doors, he caught his reflection again. Tired eyes, calloused hands. A man who lived in the shadows of ambition. He pressed a cloth against the glass and whispered softly, "It's enough." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't entirely true. Something in his chest stirred restlessly, something that refused to be silenced forever. Back upstairs, the boardroom lights had been left on. He walked inside and paused. From the massive window, the city glittered like 1,000 possibilities he could never afford. He set down his bucket, pulled out a rag, and ran it across the glass table one last time. His reflection looked back, just a janitor in a suit and tie world. But the building hummed differently tonight, as if holding a secret just out of reach. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the shadows he lived in were about to cast him into a story larger than anything he had ever imagined. And it all began with a boy at home who believed his father was more than invisible. The hum of the vacuum had faded hours ago, leaving the conference floor in silence, broken only by the swish of Ethan's cloth against the glass table. He worked slowly, not because the smudges were stubborn, but because something about the stillness felt heavier tonight. The rest of the building was asleep, executives tucked into penthouses, assistants chasing deadlines from home, but here, under the pale glow of recessed lights, Ethan lingered. Each sweep of his hand left behind a mirror's shine, and for a fleeting second his reflection stared back at him from the tabletop. Weary eyes, shoulders hunched, a man made invisible by repetition. He exhaled, ready to gather his supplies, when the doors flew open with a force that startled even the quiet walls. She entered like a storm wrapped in silk. Victoria Halden. The name carried weight across headlines and stock markets, whispered in tones of admiration and fear. To the city, she was the ruthless architect of Halden Global's empire, the woman who could dismantle rivals with the flick of a pen. To Ethan, she was something else entirely. Though the memory was so old, he sometimes wondered if he had imagined it. She strode into the room without hesitation, her voice crisp and clipped as she spoke into a sleek Bluetooth device. "No delays, Mark. If the acquisition doesn't close by Friday, we pull. I don't negotiate with hesitation." Her heels clicked against marble like a metronome of power. She didn't notice him at first, not really, because people like her rarely noticed men like him. Ethan froze, rag still in his hand as if the slightest movement would draw unwanted attention. But it was no use. Her gaze, sharp and searching, swept across the room and landed on him. It should have been nothing, just a janitor caught out of place, lingering where he didn't belong. But the moment stretched, taut and unyielding. She blinked once, her words faltering in her ear. For a second, her perfectly composed face fractured. Not confusion, not annoyance, something else. Recognition, but not the polite kind. Recognition that reached beyond names and uniforms, beyond the roles the world had carved for them. Ethan's throat tightened. His chest rose in a shallow breath that he hoped she couldn't see. He hadn't been in the same room with her in over a decade, hadn't heard her voice without the filter of news broadcasts or press releases. Yet here she was, flesh and blood, as commanding and untouchable as the skyscraper she ruled. His pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't know whether to look away or stare back, whether to vanish into the shadows or step forward into the light of what once was. She broke first, her lips parting as if words might follow, but none came. Instead, she gave the smallest of nods, a gesture so restrained it could have been mistaken for courtesy. Then she turned, finishing her call with renewed steel in her tone. "No excuses, Mark." "Make it happen." She swept past him without another glance, her perfume trailing in the air like the ghost of a memory he had tried to bury. The door shut behind her with a decisive click, but the silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, rag dangling uselessly at his side. His heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of questions he wasn't ready to face. Did she truly see him, or was he just another shadow in the corner of her empire? And if she did recognize him, why had she left without a word? He sank into one of the leather chairs at the table, staring at the spotless surface he had just polished. His reflection wavered there, distorted by the light, and for a terrifying moment he thought he saw not just himself, but the echo of a younger man, uniform pressed, eyes full of fire, standing beside a woman whose gaze once softened in his presence. He pressed a hand to the glass as if it might steady him, but the truth pressed back harder. He had told himself he was done with her years ago. That chapter closed, sealed, and buried beneath layers of grief and survival. Yet one look across that table, one flicker of recognition in her eyes, had undone the lie. She had walked out of the room, but she had also walked straight into the fragile scaffolding he had built to hold himself together. The city outside glittered against the night, its lights reflecting in the glass walls of the boardroom. Ethan stood slowly, forcing his legs to move, gathering his bucket and supplies with the precision of habit. He tried to focus on the familiar, the squeak of the mop, the weight of the rag, the scent of disinfectant, but none of it dulled the echo of her presence. He felt it in the air, lingering like electricity after lightning. By the time he left the room, the table gleamed like nothing had happened. But inside, Ethan knew something had shifted. The invisible janitor had been seen, not by just anyone, but by the one person he had both longed for and dreaded. A ghost had walked through the door tonight, and though she left without speaking, her silence said more than words ever could. And Ethan, for the first time in years, was no longer certain he could stay invisible. The apartment smelled faintly of reheated pasta and garlic bread gone slightly stale, the kind of meal Ethan leaned on after long nights when energy was short and money even shorter. The radiator hissed in the corner, fighting the chill seeping in through cracked window frames, and the muted hum of the city outside rattled against the glass. Ethan moved around the tiny kitchen with the slow rhythm of a man who had learned how to stretch every dollar and every ounce of strength. Behind him, at the worn wooden table scarred by years of crayon, spilled juice, and the weight of homework assignments, Noah bent over his sketchbook. His tongue peeked out in concentration, a pencil scratching across the page with determined strokes. "Dad," Noah said suddenly, not looking up, "I drew her again." Ethan turned with a plate in hand, the fork clinking softly against porcelain. The words caught him off guard. His son rarely said things without reason, and when he did, Ethan paid attention. "Her?" Ethan asked, forcing a casual tone. Noah lifted the page. The sketch froze Ethan in place. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The lines were simple, but precise. Noah had a gift for detail. And there she was, Victoria Halden. The sharp cheekbones, the narrow, piercing eyes, the expression that carried both distance and control, captured with uncanny accuracy in graphite and shading. Ethan's stomach dropped, the fork slipping from his hand and clattering onto the countertop. "Why'd you draw her?" he managed, his voice lower than he intended. Noah shrugged, flipping his pencil between his fingers like it was no big deal. "She looks like someone I know. Kind of like you, but not." He said it with the innocence of a child who didn't understand the gravity of his words. He had no way of knowing how sharp they cut. Ethan's throat tightened. A pulse beat hard against his temple. He forced a chuckle, masking the storm inside. "You think everyone looks like me when you're bored, kiddo." He reached over, ruffling Noah's hair with a hand that wasn't as steady as it should have been. Noah giggled, unconcerned, and bent back over the page, shading in the crease of Victoria's suit jacket with a precision that reminded Ethan too much of another set of hands he hadn't seen in over a decade. The microwave beeped. Ethan turned quickly, using it as an excuse to break the moment. He pulled out the container of pasta, steam rising as if it could fog over the memory trying to claw its way free. He stirred the food, his mind far away. He could hear her laugh, low and rare, in the back of his memory. He could still see the way she had looked at him once, long before power hardened her gaze. That summer had been a different lifetime, a different man, a different Victoria. And then it ended, as quickly as it began. She had walked away, chasing ambition while he was left holding the pieces of what could have been. He had locked that night away, buried it beneath years of janitorial shifts and bedtime stories with Noah, beneath exhaustion and survival. But seeing her in the boardroom earlier, then seeing her drawn in his son's steady pencil lines, it was too much like fate refusing to stay buried. "Dad?" Noah's voice broke through his thoughts. Ethan blinked, turning back. His son's eyes were curious, not suspicious, but they were watching him closely. Noah was perceptive, more than Ethan ever gave him credit for. "You okay?" "You're staring at it like it's haunted or something." Ethan forced a smile, setting the plate of pasta down in front of him. "Just surprised you're not drawing superheroes tonight." Noah shrugged, taking a bite before answering. "She's kind of like one. Not like Superman or anything, but she looks important, like she decides stuff." Ethan sat down heavily across from him, his own plate untouched. "She does," he said quietly, before he could stop himself. Noah tilted his head. "You know her?" Ethan froze again. The air felt suddenly too thin in the room, the radiator's hiss suddenly too loud. He picked up his fork, twirling pasta he had no appetite for. "Everyone in this city knows who she is," he said carefully. "She's the boss of that whole building, the one I clean every night." "Oh." Noah looked back at the sketch, studying it with narrowed eyes. "She looks like someone who's always thinking about stuff she can't say." The words landed heavier than the boy could have intended. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. That had always been true of Victoria, even when she was younger, even when she was with him. She carried unspoken things in her eyes, secrets he'd never been able to touch. Dinner passed quietly, Noah humming while he scribbled new lines into the background of his sketch. Ethan sat there pushing food around his plate, each scrape of the fork sounding like a clock ticking too loudly. He told himself he could let it go, that it was just a coincidence, that his son had seen her face on television, in the newspapers, on some passing billboard, and drawn what he remembered. Children did that. They absorbed the world like sponges and pressed it back onto paper. But deep down, Ethan knew better. Some things weren't coincidences. Some things circled back, no matter how far you tried to run from them. And tonight, at a chipped wooden table in a cramped apartment, his son had unknowingly pulled a ghost out of the shadows. When Noah finally yawned and carried his sketchbook to his bedroom, Ethan sat alone in the kitchen. The radiator ticked. The city hummed. He picked up the drawing one last time, his fingers brushing over the lines of Victoria's face. The likeness was too perfect, too alive. His chest ached with the weight of memory, and though he wanted to laugh it off, to bury it again, the truth was already stirring. A memory he couldn't ignore, a night he had locked away years ago, and now, because of a boy with a pencil and a gift for seeing what others missed, the lock had broken. The ballroom smelled of fresh varnish and lilies, a mixture of wealth and artifice that clung to the air like perfume. Ethan had been called in early, hours before the catering trucks arrived, to make sure the place shone like the donors expected. He rolled his cart across the parquet floor, the squeak of its wheels echoing through the cavernous room, and looked up at the chandelier that hung like frozen rain above him. 50 tiers of crystal, every facet waiting to catch the light and scatter it across the crowd of millionaires who would soon arrive in tailored tuxedos and gowns that cost more than his yearly rent. He unfolded the tall ladder and climbed, rag and spray in hand, until he was close enough to see his own reflection fractured in the glass. The work demanded care. Each crystal was polished individually, fingerprints wiped away as though they had never existed. Ethan worked in silence, the kind of silence that hums with unspoken stories. Down below, he heard the voices of two junior executives drifting in from the hallway. They were checking table arrangements, their laughter too casual, too careless to be kept private. "No kids, no husband, just ice and ambition," one said with a chuckle. The other snorted. "She's married to her empire." Can you imagine living like that? All work, no warmth. Ethan froze, cloth in hand, his knuckles whitening around the stem of a crystal pendant. A sharp breath burned in his chest. They didn't know her. They thought they did, but they only saw the headlines, the power plays, the polished steel exterior she wore in boardrooms. They didn't know the girl who used to laugh with her whole face, who once sketched dreams on napkins and believed in things bigger than herself. They didn't know about the summer when everything had felt possible, before ambition turned into armor and choices cut deeper than they were meant to. He clenched his fists until the rag twisted tight in his grip. The executives walked on, their words dissolving into the distance, but their voices echoed in his mind. He wanted to shout after them, to tell them they had no right to speak of her like that. But he didn't. He never did. His job was silence. He descended the ladder slowly, boots thudding against the steps, and stood in the center of the room for a moment, staring at the chandelier's shimmer. His reflection looked back at him in 1,000 tiny shards, like a man split apart. He shook his head, forcing the memories down, and pushed the cart toward the stage where a grand piano waited beneath its protective cover. He straightened the fabric with careful hands, brushing away invisible dust, his fingertips lingering as though the instrument might answer a question he hadn't dared to ask in years. This was her world now, these halls, these lights, these rooms filled with people who clapped for her power, but never saw the woman beneath it. His world was in the shadows, cleaning up their champagne spills and polishing away the evidence of nights they would forget by morning. Their paths had diverged long ago, and he had accepted that truth, carried it like a stone in his chest. But standing in the ballroom, hearing her name whispered and twisted by people who had no idea who she really was, Ethan felt the stone shift. He thought of Noah, of the sketch on the kitchen table, of the boy's innocent words, "She looks like someone I know." He thought of the night in the boardroom when her eyes had met his, sharp and haunting. He told himself again that it was buried, that he had buried it. And yet, as he polished the last crystal and the chandelier caught the light, scattering it across the empty floor in shards of brilliance, Ethan realized the truth. Some things don't stay buried. Not love, not memory, not the kind of choices that change the shape of a man's life forever. He packed his cloths back into the cart, exhaling slowly. The gala would begin in a few hours, and with it, the world she had built would come alive. He told himself he would stay invisible, just another shadow moving through her empire. But deep down, he knew the shadows were stirring and the past had begun to seep through the cracks. The ballroom glowed with a kind of staged perfection, every orchid positioned like a painting, every linen crease ironed into submission. The air carried that unmistakable scent of money, disguised as elegance, lilies, waxed floors, fresh polish. Ethan kept his head down, his rags sliding across the edge of a table, pretending not to notice the weight of the chandeliers overhead. His son trailed nearby, quiet as he usually was when Ethan let him come along to these early setups. Noah carried his sketchbook under one arm, sneakers squeaking softly on the marble whenever he forgot to tiptoe. Ethan had warned him more than once that this wasn't a place for kids, but he also knew Noah's silences too well. When the boy went wordless, it meant something inside him was working too hard to carry alone. The click of heels broke the stillness, sharp, deliberate, echoing with authority. Victoria Halden entered the ballroom as if the place bent itself around her presence. Her eyes swept over the arrangements, the placement of glasses, the symmetry of the stage backdrop. Assistants scrambled in her wake, but her focus remained unshakably her own. She didn't walk into rooms like other people, she occupied them, claimed them, as if every marble tile was just another asset in her portfolio. Noah peeked from behind a column, curiosity widening his eyes. He tugged gently at Ethan's sleeve, whispering before Ethan could stop him. "Daddy, she looks just like you." The words landed like a fist to Ethan's chest. His lungs tightened, his pulse jumped. He pulled Noah back quickly, pressing a finger to his lips. "Stay quiet," he murmured, voice rougher than he intended. But the damage was done. Victoria turned. It wasn't a slow turn, not the casual glance of someone idly surveying a room. It was sharp, instinctive, as though something had brushed against her subconscious and demanded attention. Her gaze landed on Noah. For the briefest moment, her composure cracked. The steely mask she wore so naturally slipped just slightly, enough for Ethan to see what lived beneath, the flicker of surprise, recognition, maybe even something tender. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, before narrowing again, as though sealing away whatever had escaped. But Ethan had seen it. He knew her too well not to. He stepped in front of Noah, shielding him with his body. "Stay out of sight," he muttered again, though the words were more for himself than the boy. His hands shook against the rag he still held. He didn't dare look at her directly. Victoria's gaze lingered a heartbeat longer, caught between the boy's wide eyes and the man standing in front of him. Something unspoken passed between them, a cord pulled taut across years of silence. Then she blinked, smoothed her expression, and turned back to the waiting staff, her voice slicing through the air with its usual precision. "These chairs need to be aligned perfectly. We don't tolerate disorder." The room resumed its hum of activity, but Ethan couldn't shake the moment. He felt Noah press against his side, small fingers clutching the fabric of his jumpsuit. "Why'd she look at me like that?" Noah whispered. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing calm into his voice. "She didn't," he lied gently. "She was just checking the setup. That's all." But the lie sat heavy in his mouth, because he had seen the truth flicker across Victoria's face, as brief as lightning. She had seen Noah, really seen him, and something in her armor had cracked. Ethan turned away, focusing on his work, but his mind wouldn't still. It wasn't just the recognition in her eyes that haunted him. It was the way his son's words echoed in his chest, relentless and sharp. "She looks just like you." Ethan polished the glass until his reflection blurred, wishing the past could be wiped away as easily. But some things clung, no matter how hard you scrubbed. And now, in a ballroom dressed for perfection, with his son at his side and the woman he had once loved standing only a few steps away, Ethan realized the past was no longer content to stay buried. It was stirring, demanding to be seen, no matter how desperately he wanted to stay invisible. The hallway outside Victoria Halden's office was hushed, carpet swallowing every sound. The gala setup had wound down, staff dismissed one by one until only a few late workers remained. Ethan pushed his mop bucket down the polished corridor, his movement slow, deliberate, as though dragging time with him. He kept one eye on Noah, who trailed a few steps behind, restless but quiet. The boy clutched his sketchbook the way some children carried stuffed animals, a shield against unfamiliar spaces. When Ethan stopped to wring out his mop, Noah drifted toward a doorway left ajar. Victoria's office. The glow of a desk lamp spilled into the hall like a secret escaping. "Stay close, kiddo," Ethan murmured, distracted with his work. Noah slipped inside anyway, his sneakers soundless on the thick rug. The office was a world unlike their cramped apartment, a cathedral of glass and leather, every object deliberate, expensive, immovable. Noah's gaze roamed over the shelves lined with awards, the neatly stacked files, the untouched crystal decanter. Then his eyes landed on the desk. Beneath a heavy glass paperweight, half hidden by documents, lay a photograph. He stepped closer, heart ticking faster without knowing why. The photo was faded at the edges, softened by time, but the faces were clear. A younger Ethan in military uniform, sharp and proud, arm brushing against a younger Victoria. They were smiling. Not the guarded smiles of the powerful, but the kind that belonged to people who believed in tomorrow. "Daddy?" Noah's voice trembled as he called out, clutching the frame with both hands. "Why are you in this picture with her?" The sound jolted Ethan. He spun from the hall, heart seizing. When he entered the office and saw the photograph in Noah's hands, everything inside him froze. His chest constricted as though the air had been ripped away. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking the photo with shaking fingers. His younger self stared back at him from behind the glass, a stranger and yet not. The uniform, the easy smile, the woman beside him, memories he had sealed off in a locked box and buried deep, were now laid bare in his son's hands. "Noah," he said softly, his voice rough with panic, and something deeper, "you shouldn't be in here." "But it's you," Noah insisted, eyes wide. "And her. Why didn't you tell me?" Before Ethan could summon words, the door opened. The sound was sharp, final, like a gavel striking wood. Victoria stood in the doorway, frozen mid-step. For once, she was not the unshakable CEO who commanded every room. Her eyes widened, her mask slipping as she registered the scene, Ethan holding the photograph, Noah looking between them with confusion and awe. Her composure faltered. It wasn't anger that flickered across her face. It was something far more dangerous, recognition. The silence that followed was louder than any boardroom speech. The lamp hummed softly. The clock on the shelf ticked, but in the space between their 3 breaths hung a truth none of them were ready to speak. Ethan's hand tightened on the photograph until his knuckles whitened. He felt exposed, stripped down to the man he used to be, not the invisible janitor, but the soldier who once believed he had a future with the woman standing in the doorway. His chest burned with words he couldn't say, questions he couldn't ask, pain he had spent years burying under work and fatherhood. Victoria's eyes darted from him to Noah. She didn't speak, but her silence carried weight. For a fraction of a second her gaze softened, her armor cracking to reveal a glimmer of something almost human, shock, maybe regret. Then she straightened, shoulders squaring, as though willing herself back into control. But the slip had already happened. Ethan saw it. Noah looked up, his small voice breaking the air again. "Daddy, what does it mean?" Neither answered. The photograph lay between them like evidence in a trial none of them wanted to begin. Ethan's heart pounded so loud he wondered if Noah could hear it, if Victoria could. He wished he could shield his son from the truth, but the truth had already slipped out of the shadows, alive in paper and ink. Victoria took a single step into the room. She didn't reach for the photo. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, her eyes locked on Ethan's, her silence saying more than any words could. And in that silence, the past returned, undeniable. It had been waiting, patient, buried beneath years of survival and ambition. Now it was here, exposed under the soft glow of a desk lamp, staring them all in the face. The office emptied one body at a time, the shuffle of polished shoes and hushed voices fading until the last door clicked shut. Outside, the building still hummed with gala preparations, but here, behind glass walls and mahogany, silence pressed in like a storm cloud. Victoria stood near her desk, her back to the window, arms crossed as if bracing against something that could not be held back. Ethan lingered by the door, his mop bucket abandoned in the hall. He didn't need to be told to stay. Her eyes had pinned him there the moment she dismissed everyone else. "You never told me," she said at last, her voice low, roughened by something he hadn't heard in years. Not authority, not calculation, something closer to pain. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent a decade building walls inside himself, and her voice rattled them all at once. "You made your choice," he answered, sharper than he intended. "You walked away." Her chin lifted slightly, but her hands betrayed her, trembling at her sides before she clasped them together again. "Don't you dare put it all on me." The words were flint against steel, sparks flying in the air between them. Old wounds ripped open, too raw to touch, too loud to silence. The photograph still lay on her desk, half-shadowed beneath the lamp, a relic of what they had once been. Noah shifted nervously, his small figure caught between them. His wide eyes darted from one face to the other, confusion shadowing his features. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice thin, a thread in the thick air. Ethan's heart broke at the sound. He dropped to one knee in front of his son, pulling his focus away from Victoria, away from the battlefield of memory and accusation. His hand rested gently on Noah's shoulder. "It's nothing, buddy," he said softly, though the lie scraped against his throat. He forced a smile, the kind that was meant to reassure but couldn't quite hide the storm brewing in his chest. Noah looked unconvinced, glancing back toward Victoria, who hadn't moved. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice cracked just enough to betray the truth. "It's everything." The words cut through the room, heavier than any scream. Noah's brow furrowed, questions hovering on his tongue, but Ethan stood quickly, pulling the boy closer to his side, as if he could shield him from words alone. "Don't," Ethan said to her, his voice low but firm. "Not here, not with him." Victoria's eyes glistened in the lamplight, her composure slipping in jagged edges. "You think I wanted this?" she asked. "You think it was easy to walk away? I didn't stop caring. I never—" She broke off, swallowing hard, as if even her own words were too dangerous. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "Then why did you?" His voice cracked on the question, raw with years of silence. "Why leave me standing there like none of it mattered?" For a long moment she couldn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the photograph, then to Noah, then back to Ethan. The weight of all she hadn't said hung heavy between them. Noah pressed closer into his father's side, his voice small. "Daddy, did you know her before?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the ache in his chest almost unbearable. He bent down, brushing his hand gently through Noah's hair. "Yeah," he said quietly, "a long time ago." Victoria turned away, her shoulders rigid, as though the skyline outside might anchor her, but her reflection in the glass betrayed her, a woman cracked beneath her own armor, staring at the ghost of what she'd lost. Ethan held Noah close, his voice softer now, almost weary. "We don't need to do this," he said, but Victoria's answer was barely above a whisper, trembling with truth. "We already are." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with everything they had tried to bury: regret, longing, choices that had shattered two lives and built walls too high to climb. Yet in the center of it all stood a boy, wide-eyed and innocent, holding a sketchbook under his arm as though it might protect him from the weight of a past he never knew existed. And in that fragile moment, Ethan realized the past wasn't just knocking at the door. It had already stepped inside, refusing to leave. The rooftop garden was quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed with secrets too heavy to share below. The city stretched out in every direction, glittering towers piercing the night sky, headlights tracing veins of light through the dark streets. Ethan stepped out onto the stone terrace, the door clicking shut behind him. The scent of damp soil and clipped roses lingered in the cool air, mingling with the faint hum of traffic far below. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched, as though bracing against more than the wind. Victoria stood near the railing, her back to him, staring at the skyline as if it belonged to her. In many ways it did. She didn't turn right away when he approached. The air between them was thick, charged with years of silence that neither had been willing to break. Only when his footsteps echoed across the terrace did she glance over her shoulder, her face half in shadow, half lit by the city's glow. "You came," she said softly. Not a question, but a statement tinged with something like relief. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "You asked." His voice was low, steady, but inside he was unraveling. For a long moment they just stood there, the night wind tugging at their clothes, the past pressing in around them. Then Victoria drew a breath, her arms crossing as if to hold herself together. Do you remember the last time we stood together like this? His throat tightened. He remembered too well. The rooftop hadn't been this one, but another in another part of the city, younger and rawer. She had been radiant then, eyes bright with ambition, heart torn between two lives. He had just come home from service, carrying scars she couldn't see. They had promised forever in whispers that neither could keep. "I remember," Ethan said. Her gaze softened briefly before hardening again. "I thought I could choose. Career, power, proving myself. I told myself love could wait, that you would wait." She turned back to the skyline, her voice dropping. "But I was wrong. You didn't wait, and I didn't either." Ethan's jaw flexed. "I couldn't," he said quietly. "Life doesn't pause because someone walks away." He looked down, hands tightening into fists. "I had responsibilities. My son needed me. I chose him." At the mention of Noah, something flickered across her face. She had seen the boy, seen the sketchbook clutched to his chest, the way he looked at Ethan with trust unshakable. "He's yours," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "He has your eyes." Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just the powerful CEO who commanded boardrooms, but the woman he had once held under starlight. The years had carved sharpness into her, but beneath it he still recognized the girl who once doodled future plans on napkins and laughed at the absurdity of them. "Noah doesn't know," he said. "Not about us. Not about any of it. And I'd like to keep it that way." Her eyes met his, wounded. "Why? Because I made the wrong choice?" "Because he deserves better than ghosts," Ethan said firmly. "He deserves parents who don't let ambition or regret dictate his life." Silence pressed down again, heavier this time. She turned back to the city, blinking hard, her control slipping for just a moment. "I thought I could build a world where I wouldn't need anyone. But when I saw him, when I saw you," her voice faltered. "The world I built suddenly felt hollow." Ethan stepped closer, his shadow falling across hers. "We can't rewrite the past, Victoria." "No," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But maybe we can face it." For a moment the city lights flickered against their silence, painting them in fragments of gold and silver. Years of distance hung between them, yet in the quiet of the rooftop garden, with the weight of truth finally pressing into the open, it felt like a bridge had been laid, fragile but real. Noah had done what neither of them had dared. He had unknowingly pulled two broken halves back into the same space. And as Ethan turned his gaze out over the glittering city, he realized the shadows they had both been hiding in no longer felt safe. They felt temporary. The apartment was dim when they returned, the single lamp by the couch throwing soft yellow light against the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the city's noises seeped in through the thin windows. Sirens far away, a neighbor's laughter, the steady hum of traffic that never slept. Ethan dropped his keys into the chipped bowl on the counter and exhaled, shoulders heavy with the weight of the evening. Noah set his sketchbook down on the table and hovered nearby, restless. The boy's silence was never empty. It always came before questions, the kind that pressed at Ethan's ribs long after they were asked. It didn't take long. "Why do you have her picture?" Noah blurted out, his voice sharp with a mixture of confusion and hurt. He wasn't angry. Noah never spoke in anger, but his words carried something heavier, betrayal. "Why was it on her desk? Why do I look like her?" Ethan froze, his hand still resting on the counter. He had rehearsed so many conversations in his head, what he'd say when Noah asked about his mother, how he'd explain why life turned out the way it did. But this question was different. This one belonged to the part of his life he had never planned to share. He turned slowly, his face shadowed in the dim light. "It's complicated," he said softly. But Noah shook his head, eyes narrowing. "You never tell me anything. Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" Ethan sank into the chair at the table, running a hand over his face. He wanted to be honest, but honesty carried its own dangers. How could he explain to a child that Once upon a time, he had loved a woman who had chosen power and legacy over the life they could have built together, that he hadn't been enough for her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as he searched for words that didn't exist. Sometimes, he began carefully, people make choices they think are right at the time, choices that feel bigger than anything else, and those choices, they change the path you're on. He looked up at Noah then, his voice steady even as his chest ached. But those choices don't erase what was real, what we had, what we felt. Noah's expression softened, confusion giving way to something quieter. He pulled out the chair opposite his father and sat, legs swinging above the floor. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost afraid of the question itself. "Do you still love her?" Ethan's breath caught. The room seemed to shrink, the sound of the radiator hissing in the corner suddenly too loud. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, silence filled the space between them, thick and telling. His son's eyes searched his face, looking for an answer that Ethan couldn't bring himself to give. Finally, Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer him relief. "Love doesn't just disappear," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It changes. It hides. Sometimes it even hurts, but it doesn't vanish." Noah studied him for a long moment, his small hands folded on the table. He didn't push further, but the weight of the question lingered in the air like smoke. He reached for his sketchbook, flipping through the pages until he found the drawing of Victoria. His pencil lines, precise and deliberate, seemed to carry more truth than Ethan's carefully chosen words. Noah traced the outline of her face with his fingertip, then looked back at his father. "She looks like someone you never forgot," he said simply. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, to reassure his son that the past didn't matter, that what they had together, this small apartment, these shared nights, their survival, was enough. But he couldn't lie, not to Noah. The boy had inherited not just his eyes, but also his ability to see through silence. Ethan reached across the table, covering Noah's hand with his own. "What matters now is you," he said firmly, though the ache in his voice betrayed him. "Always you." Noah nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on the sketch a moment longer. And in that silence, Ethan knew the truth had already settled in his son's heart, no matter how carefully he tried to bury it. The penthouse was silent, a kind of silence that felt curated, like everything else in Victoria Halden's life. The glass walls opened to the city skyline, a tapestry of lights blinking against the dark. But tonight, the view gave her no satisfaction. She slipped off her heels by the door and crossed the polished floor barefoot, the quiet click of her wineglass against the counter echoing louder than it should have. She poured a deep red into the glass and held it up to the light, swirling it, but she didn't drink. Her reflection stared back at her from the liquid surface, distorted and tired. Her gaze drifted to the far corner of her study. She hesitated before walking to the desk, her fingers brushing the smooth surface like she needed permission. She pressed the small latch beneath the bottom drawer, and with a soft click, it slid open. Inside was a neat stack of envelopes, edges curled with time, the paper yellowing slightly at the corners. Letters she had written and never sent, letters to Ethan. She lifted the top one carefully, the way some people handled relics or prayers. Her handwriting stared back at her, familiar yet foreign. The first line blurred before her eyes. "I thought of you today. The city feels smaller without you in it." She had written that on a flight to London, sitting in first class with champagne at her elbow and a contract worth billions waiting at the other end. She remembered gripping the pen harder than she should have, her hand trembling with every word she didn't dare speak aloud. There were dozens more, words scribbled in hotel rooms after midnight, in boardrooms during endless pauses, in penthouses that echoed with too much space. She had buried them in this drawer, just like she had buried the girl she used to be, the one who once dreamed of something simple, who once let herself laugh without checking to see who was watching. For years, she told herself ambition required sacrifice, that to reach the top, she had to carve away everything soft, everything fragile, everything that made her human, and she had believed it until tonight. Until she saw Noah's face. His resemblance to Ethan had struck her like a blow, but it wasn't just the shape of his eyes or the curve of his jaw. It was the warmth in him, the quiet honesty, the way he looked at the world as though it deserved kindness even when it didn't. He carried Ethan's steadiness, his patience, his stubborn refusal to bend, and all of it reminded her of what she had let go. She set the letter back on the stack, her fingers trembling. The city beyond the glass pulsed with life, but she felt no part of it. For the first time in years, she asked herself the question she had spent so long avoiding. What exactly had she gained, and what had it cost? Her empire stood tall, untouchable. She had wealth, power, influence. But when she closed her eyes, all she saw was a boy clutching a sketchbook, looking at his father as if he were the world itself. She envied that look. She envied the bond she had once been offered and turned away from. Victoria leaned back in her chair, the wine still untouched in her hand. Her throat tightened as she whispered into the empty room, "What if I sacrificed the wrong thing?" The words dissipated into the penthouse air, met by silence. She looked back at the drawer, at the letters stacked like confessions she had never dared to make. For years, she thought she had mastered regret, turned it into something useful, buried it beneath numbers and contracts. But Noah had changed that. One glimpse of his face, his resemblance to the man she once loved, and the carefully built walls she had lived behind no longer felt unbreakable. They felt thin, fragile, almost ready to fall. She closed the drawer gently, but the weight of it pressed harder than ever. Then she set down the wine, untouched, because she knew no drink could dull the ache of finally realizing the truth. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, each crystal catching the light, as though wealth itself had been suspended above the crowd. The charity gala was in full motion, a current of silk gowns, sharp tuxedos, and laughter that never reached the eyes. Waiters moved like shadows through the tide of guests, silver trays balancing glasses of champagne. At the center of it all, Victoria Halden commanded the room with her usual precision. She was a vision of elegance, every gesture calculated, every smile honed into perfection. To the donors and dignitaries gathered, she was unshakable, a queen among courtiers. Ethan watched from the edges, mop and rag replaced tonight by a discreet uniform that allowed him to blend with the staff. He had polished these floors, aligned these chairs, made sure the chandeliers caught the light just so, but no one noticed him. That was his role. Invisible, essential, unseen. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he preferred it that way. But as he caught glimpses of Victoria beneath the chandeliers, laughter circling her like an orbit, the lie pressed harder in his chest. Noah had insisted on coming along, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, like always. Ethan had meant for him to stay tucked away backstage, safe from curious eyes, but children were not made for shadows. While Ethan carried out his work in silence, Noah slipped further than he should have, edging closer to the glowing heart of the ballroom. It happened in a breath. The music swelled, a violin crying out, and Noah wandered past a column into the spill of the spotlight. He froze there, a small figure with wide eyes, clutching his sketchbook to his chest as though it could shield him from the sudden attention. A ripple moved through the crowd. One of the donors, already 2 glasses deep, chuckled and leaned toward his companion. "That boy looks like he could be Victoria's kid." The laughter that followed was careless, easy, meant to dissolve into the music. But it didn't. It spread low and knowing, until more voices joined in. The words struck Ethan like a physical blow. He went still, his breath locked in his throat. His heart pounded, not because of the remark, but because of its truth. Victoria's gaze cut across the ballroom and landed on Noah. For one terrible, beautiful moment, her mask slipped. The polish, the poise, the armor she wore so naturally, all but shattered. Her eyes widened just slightly, and something raw and human broke through. Shock, recognition, maybe even longing. Ethan's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He pushed through the staff, slipping between guests until he reached Noah's side. He bent quickly, his hand firm on his son's shoulder. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. Noah looked up at him, confused, sensing the weight of something far larger than himself. The music carried on, violins and cellos weaving a melody too delicate for the truth rising beneath it. The chandeliers glittered, champagne glasses clinked, conversations resumed. But in the air between Victoria and Ethan, something else pulsed, louder than violins, sharper than glass. She did not look away. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire ballroom had vanished, leaving only the three of them suspended in the golden light. The woman who had built an empire, the man who had chosen a different path, and the boy who unknowingly carried the bridge between them. Ethan's chest ached with the weight of it. He pulled Noah back into the shadows, away from the spotlight, away from the whispers. But the truth had already bled into the room. It lived in the laughter that would not quite fade, in the glance Victoria had failed to hide, in the silence that followed Ethan like an echo. The gala continued, polished and perfect, as though nothing had happened. But beneath the chandeliers, where the light fractured into 1,000 shards, the night had cracked open, and no music, no champagne, no careful smile could stitch it closed again. The night was built on glitter and pretense, but even the shimmer of chandeliers couldn't disguise the scent of weakness when it drifted into the air. Gregory Langston knew it better than anyone. He had spent years circling Victoria Halden, waiting for the moment when the smallest crack in her flawless armor appeared, and tonight, under the golden glow of Halden Global's charity gala, he smelled blood. He appeared at her side with a glass of whiskey in hand, his smile the kind that cut deeper than any blade. Langston always carried himself like a man who owned the room, though his wealth was borrowed from other people's ruin. Tall, silver-haired, his Italian suit pressed within an inch of perfection, he radiated smugness as naturally as he breathed. Guests parted for him without even realizing it, instinctively wary of the man who built fortunes by dismantling others. Victoria, standing near the front with her usual command, turned slightly as he approached. Her eyes flickered, only for an instant, betraying recognition and irritation, but her expression smoothed into composure. "Langston," she said evenly. "Enjoying the evening?" "Immensely." He sipped his drink, his gaze sliding past her to the crowd, to the place where Noah had stood just moments ago in the spotlight before Ethan pulled him back into the shadows. Langston's smirk widened as though he'd been waiting for exactly this. "Though I must say I never pictured you as maternal, Victoria. Quite the revelation." His words dripped like oil into the room, and though most of the surrounding donors laughed softly, unsure of the barb, Ethan, watching from the edge of the floor, felt his blood heat. His hands curled into fists so tight the rag he carried twisted in his grip. Every muscle in him screamed to step forward to silence that smug tone with a single blow, but he didn't. Not yet. He forced himself to remain still, a shadow among the staff, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. Victoria's jaw tightened. "Careful, Langston," she replied smoothly, though her voice carried a sharpened edge. "I'd hate to think you came here more interested in gossip than in the cause we're raising money for." Langston chuckled, leaning closer, his words meant only for her. "Oh, I'm always interested in causes, especially when they involve secrets. And you, Victoria, you've built your entire empire on the illusion of control. But the quickest way to lose everything?" He let the sentence hang, savoring the pause. "A secret, or worse, a family you never admitted to having." The words hit harder than the clink of any champagne flute. Victoria's mask wavered, barely, but enough. Ethan caught it, standing in the corner with the other staff, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to step in, to put himself between Langston's venom and her composure. But he knew the risk. One wrong move, one wrong word, and Noah would be dragged into the spotlight again. He couldn't let that happen. Victoria inhaled slowly, her lips curving into the kind of smile that looked elegant but concealed a blade. "You mistake me for someone who fears whispers," she said. "But then again, perhaps you've forgotten how often I've dismantled men who underestimated me." Langston's smile didn't falter, but his eyes glinted with cruel delight. "I don't underestimate you, Victoria. I know exactly what you're capable of. That's what makes this fun." He raised his glass in mock salute and drifted back into the crowd, leaving the words hanging in the air like smoke. The music swelled again, violins filling the silence he left behind, but the damage had been done. Guests leaned closer to one another, murmurs sliding between champagne bubbles and forced laughter. Victoria stood taller, her poise unshaken to anyone who didn't know her, but Ethan did. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked once toward the shadows where Noah was hidden. He saw the mask and he saw the cracks. Ethan exhaled slowly, unclenching his fists. Langston had found leverage. He had always despised her leadership, and now he had the kind of weapon no boardroom negotiation could match: a child and a secret. Ethan's chest burned with fury, but he forced himself to stay silent, for now. Because there were moments when a punch might feel good, but patience could win wars. And Ethan knew this wasn't just a battle between rivals. This was a war that had only just begun. The gala had drained from the ballroom like water slipping down a drain, leaving behind only the faint scent of champagne, the wilting orchids, and the echo of laughter that no longer belonged to the space. Staff moved like ghosts, stacking chairs and gathering abandoned glasses, their footsteps hushed, as though they, too, felt the weight of what had unfolded. Ethan had slipped out of sight once the last of the guests had gone, but not before catching the look on Victoria's face as Langston's words gnawed at her composure. For all her steel and polish, she had looked momentarily human, fragile in a way he remembered but hadn't seen in years. He found her in one of the side corridors, leaning against the wall beside a darkened alcove. The glow from a single sconce traced her silhouette, but her head was bowed, her hands gripping the folds of her gown like she was holding herself together. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, watching, his own pulse caught between memory and anger. "Victoria," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. Her mask came back quickly, that practiced expression of indifference, but her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be cleaning up?" His jaw tightened, but his voice was calm, deliberate. "If Langston comes after you, he'll use Noah." Her shoulders stiffened at the name, but she didn't reply. "I won't let that happen," Ethan continued, stepping closer, his words sharp as a promise. "Not to him." Her breath caught. For a second the mask slipped. Her voice, when it came, was raw, almost a whisper. "You'd protect me? After everything?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "I'd protect him. And whether you admit it or not, you're part of that now." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the muffled sounds of staff clearing the remains of the evening. Victoria turned her face away, blinking too fast, the edges of her control fraying. For years she had thrived on power, on holding the upper hand in every room. Yet standing there, the weight of Ethan's words pressing against her, she found herself disarmed. She didn't argue. For the first time, she didn't tell him he was wrong. She didn't remind him that he was the janitor and she was the CEO, that their worlds had been carved apart by choices long ago. She simply stood there, her silence an admission of truths she could no longer deny. Ethan shifted, his hand resting briefly against the wall beside her, his voice softer now. "Langston doesn't care who he hurts. He'll go after anyone he thinks will break you. That means Noah. That means me. That means you." Her eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, the years between them vanished. She remembered the man who had once held her on rooftops, who had spoken to her like she was more than her ambition, and Ethan saw in her eyes the woman who had once laughed without restraint, who had believed in something other than empires. "Ethan," she began, but the words faltered. What could she say? That she regretted everything? That she wished she had chosen differently? That now, seeing Noah's face, she couldn't breathe without wondering what she had lost? The sentences tangled in her throat, heavy with years of silence. He broke it for her. "You don't have to explain." His voice was steady, but underneath he was shaking. "Just know, I won't let him win." "Not at Noah's expense." She nodded slowly, a rare vulnerability softening her features. For once, she didn't fight, didn't defend, didn't turn her pain into a blade. She simply let the moment stand, the truth between them undeniable. Ethan stepped back, his gaze steady. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be worse." Victoria almost laughed, but it caught in her throat, dissolving into something closer to a sigh. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The fact that she hadn't argued was thanks enough. As Ethan walked away down the corridor, the echo of his boots fading, Victoria pressed her back harder against the wall. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the fragility she'd buried, and for the first time she didn't feel entirely alone in it. Victoria's penthouse sat high above the city, glass walls opening to a skyline that stretched forever. The place was immaculate, every piece of furniture deliberate, every surface shining like it had never known dust. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, Noah's hand small in his own. He knew stepping into this world was dangerous. It blurred lines, raised questions neither of them were ready to answer. But when Victoria extended the invitation, her voice softer than he had ever heard it, he couldn't bring himself to refuse. Noah was the first to break through the tension. He darted to the windows, pressing his palms against the glass as though he could touch the skyscrapers glowing in the night. "It's like the city's inside your house," he whispered, eyes wide with awe. His voice echoed faintly against the high ceilings, so innocent it almost hurt. Victoria watched him carefully, her hands clasped before her. For once she didn't seem like the unshakable CEO who ruled boardrooms. She seemed unsure, almost nervous. "Would you like to see the study?" she asked, her voice directed to Noah instead of Ethan. Noah nodded eagerly, and they followed him down the polished hallway. The study was less polished than the rest of the penthouse, filled with books stacked unevenly, and a few items that looked out of place, as though Victoria had allowed herself to be human here. Against the far wall sat a piano, black and gleaming, half covered with a silk cloth. Noah stopped in his tracks, pointing. "Dad used to play," he said proudly, looking from the instrument to Victoria. Her throat tightened instantly. Memories crashed into her, the sound of Ethan's fingers over keys, nights where music filled the spaces words couldn't reach, mornings when laughter followed the last fading notes. She swallowed hard, masking the tremor in her voice. "Did he now?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze on the piano. He hadn't touched one in years, not since Rachel's death, not since silence had felt safer than melody. But Noah's expectant eyes were impossible to deny. Without speaking, he walked across the room, pulled the silk cloth aside, and lowered himself onto the bench. His hands hovered above the keys for a long moment, hesitation trembling through him. Then, softly, he pressed down. The first note rang out, hesitant but pure, then another. Slowly, a melody formed, quiet, unpolished but steady, like a memory coaxed back to life. The sound filled the study, curling around them with a warmth no chandelier could mimic. Victoria stood still, watching him. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, as though the music reached into places she had long locked away. She saw him not as the janitor polishing her floors, but as the man she had once known, the one who carried fire in his hands and gentleness in his smile. Noah slid onto the bench beside his father, eyes wide, as he watched the music flow from Ethan's fingers. After a moment, he leaned forward, glancing at Victoria. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely louder than the notes themselves. "Daddy, she looks just like you when you play." The words landed like a chord too sharp to ignore. Ethan's fingers faltered, the melody stumbling before he caught it again. Victoria's breath hitched audibly, her mask breaking for a single heartbeat. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. The truth stretched between them, undeniable, ringing louder than the music itself. Noah tilted his head, studying them both, innocent curiosity lighting his face. He didn't understand the history woven into the silence, but he felt it, he saw it. And in that moment, so did they. The melody faded, the last note hanging in the air like a secret too heavy to fall. Ethan lifted his hands slowly, resting them in his lap. Victoria looked away, blinking fast, her throat tight with everything she couldn't say. No one broke the silence. They didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. The penthouse had grown quieter after Noah drifted to sleep on the couch, his sketchbook slipping from his hand as the city's glow bathed him in silver light. Ethan moved to cover him with a blanket, careful not to wake him. And when he looked up, Victoria was standing in the doorway of her study, something clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression was unreadable, poised yet fragile, as though she were about to step into a battlefield she had long avoided. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice catching on his name in a way that sent a shiver through him. She crossed the room and sat at the edge of the coffee table, setting the object down between them. It was an album, worn, leather-bound, its corners frayed from years of being handled, yet carefully preserved. Ethan's breath caught as he recognized it instantly. "I never stopped looking," she admitted, her gaze steady, but her hands trembling as she pushed it toward him. He hesitated before reaching for it, his fingers brushing the cover like it might burn him. Slowly, he opened it. The first page was a photograph of them on a summer afternoon, younger and unscarred by the choices that would come. He wore his military uniform, crisp and proud, his arm slung around her waist. She leaned into him, her laughter frozen in the frame, her eyes alight with something he hadn't seen in years. Ethan's hand trembled as he turned the page. More images spilled out, a picnic blanket spread across wild grass, a kiss stolen in the shade of a tree, her sitting at a piano while he stood behind her, both of them smiling like the future belonged to them. Each picture carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken memories, and each one pressed harder against the wall he had built inside himself. Noah stirred, lifting his head groggily. He rubbed his eyes, then blinked at the album in his father's hands. Curious, he crawled into Ethan's lap, nestling close as he peered down at the photographs. "That's you?" he asked, pointing at the young man in uniform. His voice was hushed, reverent, as if he had discovered a secret treasure. Ethan nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. "And that's her?" Noah asked again, his small finger tracing the image of Victoria, radiant and laughing in a way he had never seen her. "Yes," Ethan managed, his voice rough, almost breaking. Noah's wide eyes darted between the page and the two adults sitting before him. For the first time, he saw them not as separate worlds, but as something that had once been whole. His small body leaned into Ethan's chest, comforted by the steady beat of his father's heart, but his gaze lingered on Victoria, questions forming that he didn't yet know how to ask. Ethan turned another page, slower this time, until he stopped at a photograph of them at a carnival. Victoria had cotton candy in her hand. Ethan's cap tilted sideways on her head, both of them grinning with abandon. His fingers brushed over the image, and suddenly another hand joined his, Victoria's. Their fingers touched lightly at the edge of the photograph, the briefest contact, but it sent a spark racing through him. He looked up, and her eyes were already on his, shimmering with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Neither of them moved their hand away. The silence deepened, but it wasn't empty. It hummed with memory, with longing, with a truth they could no longer deny. Sparks of the past ignited quietly, weaving themselves into the present, bridging years of distance in a single breath. Noah's voice broke the spell, soft and certain. "You were happy," he said. Neither of them answered because he was right. The album told the story clearly. They had been happy once, and now, with the evidence spread across their laps, the question neither dared to ask hung unspoken in the air. Could they be again? The first sign of trouble came in the form of flashing lights outside the lobby. At first, Ethan thought it was just another motorcade or some VIP arrival the building had gotten used to hosting, but then the voices followed. Shouts, overlapping questions, the frantic chorus of press that smelled blood. By the time he and Noah stepped off the elevator, the glass doors were a wall of cameras. Paparazzi pressed forward, their lenses like weapons, each flash a strike. "Victoria! Is it true you've been hiding a child?" one shouted. "Who's the father, Victoria?" another barked, cameras firing like a rapid gunfire. Ethan froze, instinctively pulling Noah closer. The boy's small hand clutched his father's shirt, his wide eyes reflecting the bursts of light. The noise was overwhelming, a storm crashing against the fragile bubble of their world. And then the questions turned sharper. "Is this the boy? Is this your secret son?" Noah whimpered, covering his ears as tears welled in his eyes. Ethan's chest tightened with rage, and he shifted, placing his body between the mob and his child. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, though his own voice shook. "I've got you." He spread his arms slightly, shielding Noah from the assault of cameras, his own frame blocking as much of the chaos as he could. Then Victoria appeared, stepping out of the car that had pulled up at the curb. Her presence usually silenced rooms, commanded attention, bent situations to her will. But tonight, the noise only grew louder, harsher. The photographers surged closer, shouting accusations and questions that cut deep. She froze for a moment, her eyes catching on Noah's tear-streaked face. Her own mask, polished and perfected over years of boardrooms and battles, cracked. "This is my fault," she whispered, horror trembling in her voice as she moved toward them. Her heels clicked against the marble, but her composure faltered with each step. "I should have seen it coming. I should have—" "No!" Ethan's voice cut through, firm, resolute. He turned just enough to meet her eyes, still holding Noah against his chest. "This isn't your fault." "It's his." His jaw tightened, fury sparking in his gaze. "Langston did this." The name lingered between them like poison. They both knew it. He had threatened her at the gala, had smirked like a man who already had his weapon loaded. Now he'd fired the first shot. Cameras continued to flash, questions still hurled like stones, but for a moment the world narrowed to just the three of them. Victoria, shaken but standing. Ethan, steady and unyielding. And Noah, trembling but safe in his father's arms. "I won't let him win," Ethan said, his voice low but fierce. He wasn't speaking like a janitor or a man beaten down by years of silence. He was speaking like a soldier, like a father, like someone who had nothing left to lose except the one thing that mattered most. His arm tightened protectively around Noah. Victoria's throat worked as she tried to form words, but none came. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand hovering near Ethan's arm, as though she needed to anchor herself to his certainty. For the first time in years, they weren't adversaries standing on opposite sides of choices long past. They were allies, bound together by the child now caught in the storm Langston had unleashed. Security finally pushed through the mob, ushering them inside, the doors slamming shut behind them. The noise dulled, the glass muting the chaos, but its echo lingered in all three of their chests. Noah buried his face in Ethan's shirt, his small shoulders shaking. Ethan rubbed his back, whispering comfort, while Victoria stood close, her hand pressed to the glass, staring out at the cameras that waited like vultures. Her empire had always been her shield, her fortress. But now the walls had been breached, and for the first time she realized she wasn't facing the battle alone. Ethan's words still rang in her ears. "I won't let him win." And in the silence that followed, something shifted. They weren't just fighting for reputation or survival anymore, they were fighting for each other. The boardroom was colder than usual, though the sun spilled through the high glass windows, painting long streaks of gold across the polished table. Victoria sat at the head of it, back straight, shoulders squared, the very image of composure. Around her, the board members shuffled papers, murmuring in low voices, waiting for the proceedings to begin. On the surface, it was business as usual, but the undercurrent was poisonous. Gregory Langston had done his work well. The rumor had spread, a hidden family, a child, a scandal too human for a woman who had built herself into a machine. Victoria folded her hands, but her fingers trembled beneath the table. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting, measuring whether she was still the unshakable leader they had invested in, or a liability dressed in silk. When the chair of the board cleared his throat, the room fell into silence. "Ms. Halden," he began, his tone cool and clipped, "questions have been raised about your credibility. Rumors suggest personal entanglements that compromise your position. We require clarity." Before she could answer, the doors opened. All heads turned. Ethan stepped inside. But not as the man they were used to ignoring. Not in navy overalls or with a mop in hand. He wore his old military dress uniform, the dark fabric pressed sharp, the medals on his chest catching the sunlight with quiet authority. The air shifted instantly. Some of the members straightened unconsciously, old instincts stirred by the sight of service, of sacrifice. Victoria's breath caught, her composure faltering for just a moment. She hadn't asked him to come. She hadn't even known if he would. But here he was, walking toward her with steady steps, carrying a presence that demanded attention without raising a voice. "I'd like to speak," Ethan said, his tone low but certain. The board chair hesitated. Langston, seated smugly at the far end of the table, leaned back with a smirk. "And you are?" "Ethan Cole," he replied evenly, his gaze sweeping the room. "I work in this building. I've cleaned your floors, polished your windows, made sure you never had to see the mess you left behind at night." A murmur rippled through the board, a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. He paused, then continued. "But before that, I served this country. And in my time, I learned a thing or two about what real leadership looks like." He turned, his eyes resting on Victoria. "This woman made choices I didn't agree with. She walked away from things I thought mattered more than power. But she built an empire while carrying pain most of you couldn't survive. And now, all she wants is to protect a boy who's innocent in all this. A boy she never asked for but refuses to let be destroyed." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, alive. Even the coldest members of the board shifted in their seats, eyes flicking down to their papers, ashamed of how small their questions suddenly seemed. The medals on Ethan's chest glinted in the sun, but it wasn't the ribbons or the uniform that carried weight. It was his voice, steady and raw with truth. Langston's smirk faltered just slightly. He tapped his pen against the table, but for once, no clever retort came. Victoria's eyes shimmered. She blinked quickly, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to crack her mask. For years, she had defended herself alone, building walls higher with every attack. But in that moment, with Ethan standing beside her in full view of those who had always doubted, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The chair of the board cleared his throat again, but this time his voice was softer. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." He looked back at Victoria, his expression no longer purely calculating. Something human lingered there now, something reluctant but real. Respect. Ethan stepped back, his gaze steady on hers. And in the quiet that followed, Victoria felt something she hadn't in years. Not victory, not control, but the relief of having someone stand beside her when the walls closed in. For the first time, the weight wasn't hers to carry alone. The city was still buzzing with the aftermath of the board's decision, headlines flashing across screens and whispers slipping through corporate hallways. Gregory Langston was gone, his smirk erased as swiftly as his influence. Victoria had stood tall in the boardroom and walked out with her empire intact, but for the first time in years, that wasn't what mattered. She had kept her place, yes, but she had also found something she hadn't known she was missing until it stared her in the face with Ethan's steady eyes and Noah's quiet wonder. That evening, far from marble floors and gilded chandeliers, the three of them found themselves in the park. It wasn't planned. The city lights glittered at the edges, but here the air was softer, touched with the earthy smell of grass and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The world felt smaller, quieter, safer. Noah skipped ahead for a moment, his sneakers scuffing the path, before circling back and slipping his hands into theirs, one in Ethan's, one in Victoria's. He tilted his head up, his voice no louder than the rustling leaves. "Daddy," he whispered, "she looks just like you." Ethan's chest tightened, but this time there was no denial, no attempt to brush it away with a joke. He looked at Noah, then at Victoria, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe," he said softly, "that's not such a bad thing." Victoria's throat caught. She had spent years avoiding reflections, hating the way mirrors reminded her of choices made and lives abandoned. But here, in the soft light of a park bench, with Noah's small fingers linking them together, she didn't want to look away. She squeezed Noah's hand, then Ethan's, her grip steady, not as a CEO or a strategist, but simply as herself. For once, there were no roles, no power dynamics, no masks. Just three people, standing in the space between what had been lost and what had been found. The silence was warm, filled not with avoidance but with something new, something fragile yet strong, like the first note of a song they hadn't dared to play. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes searching, steady as ever. There was no accusation left in them, no bitterness, only recognition. He had carried the weight of survival for so long, and now for the first time, it felt like he wasn't carrying it alone. Victoria breathed in the night air, realizing how different it felt to be here, away from cameras and marble towers. Power had always been her anchor, the thing she clung to when everything else threatened to slip away. But now, walking beside Ethan and Noah, she understood that power was empty, without connection, without love, without the kind of family she had once turned away from. Noah squeezed their hands tighter, glancing between them with the innocent certainty only a child could hold. He didn't see scandal or secrets or the years that had torn them apart. He just saw two people who belonged on either side of him, two halves of the world he was building in his mind. Ethan looked down at his son, then back at Victoria. His faint smile deepened, tinged with something both weary and hopeful. "Maybe," he murmured, "this is what we were supposed to find all along." The night stretched around them, the city a blur in the distance, but in that small patch of park, it felt like time had stopped. They weren't enemies or strangers anymore. They weren't defined by ambition or regret. They were something simpler, something stronger. A new family, born not out of perfection, but out of broken pieces, choosing to fit together again. And as Noah swung their hands playfully between them, laughter spilling into the cool night, both Ethan and Victoria realized the same truth. Sometimes the family you think you lost doesn't stay lost forever. Sometimes, if you're willing to stand still long enough, it finds its way back, exactly when you least expect it. If this story touched you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because more stories of love, hope, and second chances are on the way.